Franklin and Armfield was the largest and most successful domestic slave trader in the United States. The firm was started in 1828 and closed in 1836. The firm's partners, Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, became two of the wealthiest men in America. Two key elements to the firm's success. One was its access to lines of credit from major banks from New York to New Orleans, and two, speculative fervor in the market for slaves in Mississippi and the surrounding region. The early 1830s was a time of great prosperity for the nation. The Deep South was the leading producer of cotton in the world. As the global demand for cotton rose, the price of cotton rose. The price of slaves was linked to the price of cotton. So, the price of slaves also rose. Franklin and Armfield purchased slaves in the Chesapeake Bay region at low prices and sold them in New Orleans and Natchez at drastically inflated prices. For instance, slaves could be purchased in the Chesapeake Bay region for $400 or less. However, in New Orleans, slaves could sell for as much as $1,200. The firm sold approximately 1,000 to 1,500 slaves per year. Over the course of the firm's 9-year existence, the firm sold approximately 10,000 slaves. Franklin and Armfield was active in the lucrative fancy girl trade. In New Orleans, wealthy men purchased young, light-skinned, female slaves from slave traders, like Franklin and Armfield, for the explicit purpose of sexual exploitation. Fancy girls were generally teenagers, but could be as young as 8. Fancy girls were destined to be prostitutes or concubines. Franklin and Armfield purchased young, light-skinned, female slaves in Virginia and Maryland for cash. Unfortunately, the firm's staff raped these female slaves once they were in the firm's custody. The Chesapeake Bay region had a surplus of slaves due to declining tobacco production. Slaves, rather than tobacco, became the region's leading export. Meanwhile, in the Deep South, the value of slaves was rising along with the price of cotton. This made slave breeding farms in Virginia and Maryland profitable. Slave breeding farms bred domestic slaves by means of forced sex. Black men and women were paired for mating based on their physical attributes, similar to the breeding of prized horses and cattle. Female slaves were forced to continuously have sex, possibly with different men, for the purpose of producing as many children as possible. Children would be removed as soon as they were weaned and eventually sold to a plantation in the Deep South. In 1808, the United States banned the importation of slaves from Africa, which drastically increased the value of domestically bred slaves. Beginning in the 1830s, in an effort to expand cotton production, the federal government removed Native Americans from their land in Mississippi. The removal made 18 million acres of land in Mississippi available for cotton production. The federal government then sold the land to white settlers at a cheap price. These white settlers purchased slaves from Virginia and Maryland to grow cotton in Mississippi and other parts of the Deep South. Meanwhile, powerful Southern slave owners wanted to import capital into their states so they could buy more slaves. They came up with a new two-part idea: mortgaging slaves, and then turning the mortgages into bonds that could be marketed all over the world. Southern slave owners organized new banks in states like Louisiana and Mississippi. They created a list of slaves they wanted to use for collateral. Then, the slave owners mortgaged these slaves to the bank. The loans they received allowed them to purchase more slaves to increase cotton production. Southern banks such as Citizens Bank and Canal Bank of Louisiana allowed slave owners to offer their slaves as collateral for loans. These to Southern banks would eventually be purchased by New York bank J.P. Morgan. A slave-backed loan could be acquired in two ways. First, slave owners could take out a mortgage on the purchase price of a slave by putting a percentage down and paying off the balance over time. Second, slave owners who already owned slaves could use those slaves as collateral for a loan. These Southern banks, in coordination with New York financial institutions, bundled slave-backed loans to form bonds that could be sold both nationally and internationally. The sale of these bonds created capital that could be re-injected into slave-backed lending. Investors in New York, London, Amsterdam, and Paris, by purchasing slave-backed bonds, could benefit from slavery without owning slaves or violating anti-slavery laws. As the slave owners make payments on their loans from the sale of cotton, bondholders receive payments of interest and principal on their bonds. In the early 1830s, a speculative bubble formed in places like Mississippi and the surrounding area. Slaves were being purchased on credit. It was assumed that the rising price of cotton would eventually pay off the debt. Owning as many slaves as possible became a mark of prestige. Many believed that owning slaves was a path to wealth. Speculative fervor in the Deep South drove the demand for slaves and made the firm of Franklin and Armfield wealthy. The firm used its lines of credit to purchase large numbers of slaves for cash and then sell them on credit at inflated prices. The firm sold fancy girls in New Orleans. Fancy girls sold for 4 to 5 times as much as a female field laborer. Fancy girls were destined to become prostitutes or concubines. In 1836, Franklin and Armfield closed its slave trading business. The business closed just before the Panic of 1837. The amount of cotton produced by cotton plantations began to exceed the global demand for cotton. By 1834, the price of cotton began to fall and then plunge. The fall in cotton prices triggered the Panic of 1837. Investors and creditors called in their debt, but plantation owners were underwater. The falling price of cotton also pulled down the price of slaves. Slaves that were purchased for $2,000 were now selling for $60.